The voicemail was 47 seconds long. I've listened to it 236 times. And every single time, it ends the same way, with my sister's voice saying words I can never unhear. My name is Lauren Calloway. I'm 42 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom house in a quiet suburb just outside of Columbus, Ohio, and until 14 months ago, I genuinely believed, with my whole chest in my bones, that I had a good life, a solid marriage, a career I was proud of, a sister who was my best friend, a family that, despite its usual cracks and complications, was held together at its center by real, unshakable love. I believed every bit of that. And I had no idea, not a single flicker of suspicion, not one sleepless night, of wondering about what had been happening right beneath my feet for 4 years and 4 months. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something. If this story is already making something tighten in your chest, if you've ever trusted someone completely and found out that trust was misplaced, then I need you to do one thing right now. Hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell. Because I tell stories like this every single week. Stories about real people, real betrayal, real survival, real comebacks. And I don't want you to miss a single one. Okay. Now let me tell you everything. And I do mean everything. I want to tell you this story the way it actually happened. Not the highlight real version where everything gets compressed into a clean narrative arc with a satisfying lesson at the end. But the real version, the slow, ordinary, beautiful version of the life I was living before everything changed, because I think it matters deeply that you understand what I had, what I thought I had, what was taken from me, piece by careful piece, by the two people who were supposed to love me most. It started in the way that most catastrophic things do, with something completely ordinary. A casserole dish. My sister Dana, she's 3 years younger than me, she turned 39 last spring, and she's always been the beautiful one, the one who laughs too loud, in the best possible way, and walks into rooms and somehow immediately becomes the center of them without ever seeming to try. She brought over a chicken and wild rice casserole the week that my husband Nathan and I moved into our first house together. We'd just gotten married 8 months before that. It was December, one of those gray, blanketed, perfectly still Ohio Decembers where the sky sits low and flat like a lid on a pot, and everything smells like cold air and firewood and the very particular promise of winter settling in for the long haul. Dana showed up at our door with this enormous casserole dish wrapped in a dish towel that had little pine trees on it. I still have that dish towel. I don't know why I've kept it, maybe because getting rid of it would require me to think about it, and I've been choosing my battles, and a bottle of Malbec tucked under one arm, and she hugged us both, me first and then Nathan. And she looked around at the boxes stacked in the hallway, and the bare walls, and the half-assembled bookshelf we'd abandoned the night before because we were too tired to finish it, and she said, "You two are going to be so happy here." And I remember it so clearly it's almost physical. Like I could reach back through time and touch the exact texture of that moment. I thought, she's right. We are. I was 38 years old, and I had just moved into a house with a man I loved, and my sister was standing in my doorway, holding a casserole and telling me I was going to be happy, and the world felt exactly the right size. Nathan and I had been together for 4 years before we got married. We met at a work conference in Chicago. I was attending as a project manager from my firm. He was there as a civil engineer from a development company 2 floors above us in the same downtown building, which we both found out only after the conference ended, and we'd already exchanged numbers. He was 39 at the time, 6'1", dark eyes, the kind of quiet confidence that you mistake for shyness until you've known someone long enough to understand the difference. He was good at listening. He was good at showing up. He remembered small things, not just birthdays, but the names of my coworkers, the outcome of meetings I'd mentioned in passing weeks earlier. He paid attention in a way that felt, in those early years, like being genuinely seen. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. He didn't make a production of it, which was exactly right. He knew me well enough to know I'd have hated a restaurant proposal with strangers watching. He did it on a Saturday morning, in the kitchen of his apartment, making coffee, and he turned around and he said, "I've been thinking about this for 6 months and I can't think of a single reason not to ask you, so I'm asking." And he had the ring in his coffee mug, which was either deeply romantic or logistically reckless, and I chose to see it as romantic. I said yes before he finished the sentence. We got married the following October. Dana was my maid of honor. She'd been my maid of honor from the moment I got engaged. There was never a question, never a conversation. It was simply understood the way siblings understand certain things without having to discuss them. She stood at the altar and read a passage from 1 Corinthians, the one about love being patient and love being kind, and she cried through the entire thing, not delicately, not photogenically, but in the full body, unashamed way that Dana cries with her face going red and her voice cracking and her shoulders shaking, and half the guests cried along with her because emotion is contagious and Dana has always been a carrier. Nathan and Dana had always gotten along. More than gotten along, actually. They genuinely liked each other. That was something I loved about him, the way he included my family not performatively, but authentically. He remembered Dana's birthday without me prompting him. He asked about her life in the specific way that signals you've actually been listening, not "how are things?" But what happened with that project you were stressed about? Or did you ever call that therapist you mentioned? When Dana went through her rough patch after her divorce from her first husband, a man named Theo who turned out to be emotionally unavailable and financially irresponsible in approximately equal measure, Nathan was the one who suggested we invite her over for dinner twice a week so she wouldn't be eating cereal alone in her apartment. "She's your sister," he said. "That means she's my family too." He said things like that and I would feel this warm, spreading certainty deep in my stomach, real and uncomplicated, that I had married exactly the right person. I need you to hold on to that specific feeling of certainty, because I'm going to need you to understand what it means to lose it. Dana, at the time the affair began, and I'm using that word now, the word I spent 3 months refusing to say even inside my own head, was between relationships. She'd been seeing someone casually for about a year, a guy named Marcus who worked in commercial real estate and was perfectly nice and perfectly boring, and they'd ended things mutually and without drama, which was somewhat unusual for Dana, who historically approached breakups the way other people approach natural disasters, with intensity and significant collateral damage. The mutual ending had left her in a kind of purposeless contentment, she told me, like she'd taken a breath and wasn't quite ready to exhale yet. She was coming to our house twice a week for dinner. She was texting Nathan memes she knew he'd find funny, the kind of specific, niche humor that not everyone gets. She was calling me 4 times a week, sometimes more, to talk about work and life and the novel she was reading and the absolutely unhinged behavior of the woman in the apartment above hers who vacuumed at 11 p.m. on weeknights. She was, in other words, present, woven into the fabric of our life in a way that felt entirely natural because it was entirely natural, or so I believed. She was my sister. She was always going to be part of my life. The amount of time and space she occupied in our marriage wasn't suspicious to me. It was just family. It was just us. I think about how clean that word used to feel. Us. The 3 of us. Family. I think about how I used to use it without hesitation. I'm going to tell you about the day my father died, because that was the day the first hairline crack appeared in everything I thought was solid. I didn't see it then. I walked right past it and kept going. But it was there, thin as a fault line, waiting. My father, Robert Calloway, died on a Tuesday in September. He was 68 years old and he went fast, a massive heart attack, the kind where the doctors use the phrase, likely very little time, in a way that is meant to console you, but mostly just makes you feel robbed, because time is the thing you wanted. More of and very little doesn't feel like a mercy. It feels like a crime. He'd been healthy. Or he had seemed healthy. He'd had his annual checkup 6 weeks before, and his doctor had told him his numbers looked good, the kind of good that lets a 68-year-old man believe he has runway. He had plans. He was finally going to build the workshop in the backyard. He'd been talking about that workshop since I was 14 years old, had a folder full of printouts from woodworking websites, had priced out lumber twice. He'd also had a long-standing item on a mental bucket list that he'd never quite gotten around to. He wanted to see the Grand Canyon. He'd mentioned it at Easter. He'd said maybe next year. He never got there. His name was Robert, but everyone called him Bob, and he was the kind of man whose absence leaves a specific shape in the air. He'd been a high school history teacher for 31 years and had coached the cross-country team for 22 of those years, and he had the particular quality that the best teachers have, which is that he made students feel like their lives and ideas and choices genuinely mattered to him, not as a professional courtesy, but because they actually did. He remembered former students' names decades later. He got letters at Christmas from people he'd taught in the 90s who wanted him to know they'd become the people he'd told them they could be. My mother, Patricia, was devastated in the specific way that happens when you lose someone you've spent 43 years building an entire life alongside. Someone who is not just your partner, but the scaffolding around which the architecture of your daily existence is organized. She moved through the days after his death in a kind of controlled, dignified fog, making decisions about the service, greeting the parade of people who came to the house bearing lasagnas and flower arrangements, keeping herself relentlessly busy because staying busy meant not having to stop and feel the full, crushing weight of what had happened. I recognized that coping mechanism immediately and completely. Because it is exactly what I do, and I recognized it because I learned it from her. Dana, on the other hand, fell apart in a way I found simultaneously heartbreaking and in some strange way admirable. She sobbed without embarrassment. She let people hold her. She called me 4 times a day for the first week, sometimes just to cry on the phone without even speaking. Just breathe and cry and not be alone with it. I sat with that. I let her grieve the way she needed to grieve, and I held myself together because someone had to, because I am the oldest, because I have always been the one who holds things together while other people fall apart. It is both my greatest strength and my most exhausting characteristic. Nathan was extraordinary that week. He took time off work without being asked. He handled all the logistical pieces I couldn't think straight enough to manage. The death certificates, the calls to my father's pension office, the coordination of the out-of-town family members who needed to know arrival times and parking and which hotels weren't terrible. He made sure my mother ate. He drove Dana to and from the funeral home on the days she couldn't trust herself behind a wheel. He sat with my mother while she looked through old photos and chose the ones she wanted displayed at the service, and he didn't rush her, didn't check his phone, just sat there with her as long as she needed. I remember looking at him across the room at the reception after the funeral, watching him refill my mother's water glass before she'd even noticed it was low, and I felt something so large and clean and uncomplicated that I almost couldn't contain it. I thought, how did I get so lucky? I thought, even in the worst moments, I am not doing this alone. That thought, that specific thought, I want to come back to that. The funeral was held on a Friday at St. Michael's, the Catholic church my parents had attended for 35 years. About 120 people came, former students, fellow teachers, neighbors from 3 different houses. My parents had lived in over their 43 years of marriage, coaches from other schools who'd known my dad through the athletic circuit, relatives from as far as Phoenix and Portland. It was the kind of turnout that would have embarrassed my father because he was modest to his core and deeply uncomfortable with being the center of attention, and it also would have meant absolutely everything to him, because underneath that modesty he was a man who cared profoundly about whether his life had mattered. It had mattered. The room full of people proved it. We held the reception afterward at my mother's house. One of those long, slow-burning days that feels endless in the most emotionally depleting way. You keep thinking it must be winding down, it must almost be over, and then you look at the clock, and it's 3:15 in the afternoon, and there are still 40 people in the living room, eating deli trays and telling stories about your father that you've heard before, and that you're grateful to hear. Again, even as part of you is absolutely, completely, silently falling apart. My Aunt Carol, my father's older sister, a woman who approaches every situation as an opportunity to talk about herself, cornered me for the better part of an hour near the credenza in the dining room and told me, in detail, that I did not request and could not escape about her experience losing her own mother 20 years prior. I stood there and made appropriate sounds and thought about whether there was still any of the smoked salmon left. At around 4:30, maybe 4:45, I went upstairs to use the hallway bathroom rather than the one off the kitchen that had a line. The hallway bathroom is off the small landing above the back staircase, and it's quieter up there, tucked away, the kind of space where you can steal 30 seconds of silence in the middle of an overwhelming day and just breathe. I used the bathroom. I washed my hands. I came out. And from down the hallway, from the direction of my parents' bedroom, the door resting not fully closed but not fully open, just leaning against the frame, I heard voices. I didn't think anything of it at first. People wander during these events. Family members who haven't seen the house in years want to look around. Someone needed a quiet space to make a phone call. I assumed it was my cousins or my aunt finally extracting herself from someone else's conversation, or any of a dozen other completely innocent possibilities. I almost walked back. Downstairs. My hand was literally on the banister. But something stopped me. I don't know what to call it even now over a year later with the benefit of full understanding. Instinct, maybe. Or just the particular quality of the silence between the words, the way it felt inhabited, rather than incidental. The way some silences have texture. I stood on the landing and I heard Nathan's voice. And Dana's. And they were not talking about my father. I couldn't hear everything. I want to be clear about that. The door wasn't wide open, and I wasn't close enough to catch every word and everything I did hear came in fragments, partial sentences, the half-meaning of things. But I heard her voice, low, urgent, something underneath it that I had never heard in Dana's voice before and did not immediately know how to name. And then she said, this part I heard clearly, these exact words, you can't keep doing this. This isn't fair to either of us. And he said quieter, I know, just give me time. And then silence. Not the silence of two people who are grieving. Not the silence of two people sharing a difficult memory of a man they both loved. A different silence. The kind that has weight. The kind that means something is present between two people that is not meant for outside ears. I walked away. I went back downstairs. I refilled my own water glass and I stood in the corner of the kitchen and I told myself, very firmly, very deliberately, that I had misheard. That I was raw and wrecked and exhausted. From grief and from performing competence for days on end, and that I was projecting something dark onto a moment that had a dozen possible innocent explanations. I told myself I was catastrophizing. I told myself this is what grief does. It makes you paranoid. It makes you look for something to feel other than the thing you can't bear to feel. I told myself all of that, and I went back to the reception and I talked to my father's old coaching colleague from Westland High, and I ate half a piece of coffee cake, and I drove home with Nathan that evening, and we were quiet. In the car, in the way you're quiet when you're both exhausted beyond words. And I thought it was nothing. I imagined it. I am fine. I told myself that for 10 months. 10 months of waking up next to Nathan and telling myself the voice through the door had meant nothing. 10 months of family dinners and holidays and normal Tuesdays, and telling myself I had heard wrong or misinterpreted or invented. 10 months of my own mind protecting me from something I wasn't ready to know. And then one Tuesday, an ordinary, unremarkable, completely random Tuesday. That had no reason whatsoever to be the day my life split in half, I found. The voicemail. I was working from home. 3 days a week I work remotely, I'm a senior project manager at an environmental consulting firm, and while the work is frequently tedious in the specific way that project management is tedious, I'm good at it, I've built my career on being good at it, and working from home gives me a rhythm I've come to depend on. Coffee at 7. Email at 7:30. First call at 9. Nathan had left early for a meeting downtown. He kissed me on the top of my head. I was already at my desk and said he'd be back around 6 and would I mind if we did takeout tonight because he had a report to finish when he got home. I said that was fine. I was already thinking about my 9 o'clock call. He left. About 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed. A text from Nathan. Can't find my charger. It's my car charger. Did you see it? Maybe on the nightstand. I pushed back from my desk and went upstairs to check. The nightstand on his side had a book, a water glass, and notepad. No charger. I checked the drawer. Nothing. I pulled the nightstand out from the wall, a few inches to look behind it, the way you do when you're looking for something small that might have fallen. The nightstand scraped against the hardwood, and as it shifted, a phone slid out of the partially opened drawer and dropped onto the floor with a soft, flat thud. Not his current phone. He'd texted me from that one. He had it with him. This was the older one. The Samsung he'd replaced about 8 months ago. He'd told me at the time that he was keeping it because he hadn't backed up the photos. Yet a few years of photos, he said, he kept meaning to transfer them. I had accepted this without a second thought because I had no reason to give it a second thought. People keep old phones. It is an entirely normal thing to do. I had an old phone myself in the top drawer of my desk downstairs. I picked it up off the floor. It was a little dusty. It felt like it had been there a while. And I just stood there for a moment. I want to be honest with you about this next part because honesty is the only thing I have to offer in this story. I don't know why I turned it on. I cannot give you a clean, rational explanation for what made my thumb press the power button. My therapist has a theory about this, which I'll share later. But in the moment, there was no theory and no decision. My hand just did it. The way hands sometimes know things before minds catch up. The phone powered on slowly, drawing on whatever charge it had left. A thin battery icon appeared, maybe 11%. The screen lit up, went through its boot sequence and settled into the home screen. And at the top of his voicemail icon, there was a notification badge. One unread voicemail. The contact listed was not a name. It was a single letter, D. I stared at that D for what felt like several minutes but was probably closer to 10 seconds. And in those 10 seconds, my mind did the thing minds do when they're standing at the edge of something. It offered me every possible innocent explanation. D could be David from work. D could be Doug, his old college friend who he'd lost touch with years ago. D could be any of a dozen perfectly reasonable people whose names began with D. D could be nothing. D could be something that was going to be fine. I pressed play. I need you to understand what it felt like to hear those 47 seconds. Not the content of it, I'll get to that, but the physical experience of it, the way your body responds to information before your brain has finished processing what the information means. My hand went cold around the phone. My stomach dropped about 6 inches. A sound started in my ears that wasn't external, a low, pressurized hum, like standing too close to something electrical. And underneath all of that, a terrible, clarifying stillness. Like the moment before a car accident when everything slows down and becomes brutally detailed. Dana's voice came through the speaker. Her voice. My sister's voice. Saying, "Hey, it's me. I know we said we weren't going to do this anymore. But I've been sitting here all day thinking about you and I need you to know. That last night meant everything. I'm not sorry. I know I should be. But I'm not. I love you. I know that's not supposed to be allowed. But I do. And I think you do too. So call me when you can. Or don't. I'll understand either way. Okay. Bye. 47 seconds. End of voicemail. I sat down on the bedroom floor. I did not choose to sit down. My legs simply stopped functioning in the way. Legs are supposed to function, and I ended up on the floor. I checked the time. When I landed, 10:41. I checked it again when I stood up, 11:03. I sat on the floor of my bedroom for 22 minutes with the phone in my lap and the sound of my sister's voice playing on an unending loop inside my head, and I did not cry. I did not hyperventilate. I did not scream. I did not call anyone. I just sat there in a silence so absolute that I could hear the refrigerator running 2 floors below me and the specific tick of the hallway clock that I have always found slightly irritating. And I thought very clearly, very coldly, with a precision that surprised me. 2 things. First, how long? Second, I am not going to let them know I know. Not yet. Now, let me pause the story here for 1 second and make a very important point. To you, because if you have ever been in a situation like this, if you have ever discovered something that rearranged everything, I need you to hear me. When I say this, the way I handled what came next is not for everyone. My way was strategic. It was cold in the specific way that cold sometimes is when it is actually armor and not cruelty. I am not telling you this is the right way. I am telling you it was my way, and I am telling you it worked, and I'm telling you that each person who finds themselves on this floor gets to decide what they do when they stand back up. I stood up. I put the phone back exactly where it had fallen. I put the nightstand back against the wall. I went back downstairs. I texted Nathan, no charger up. Here, sorry. I sat back down at my desk. I joined my 9 o'clock call. 4 minutes late, and apologized and participated fully for the next hour. And when Nathan came home that night, I had made pasta, not takeout pasta, from scratch because I had needed something to do with my hands, and I set the table and poured wine, and I asked him about his day, and I listened to his answer, and we ate dinner, and we talked about the paint color we'd been going back and forth on for the dining room, and I went to bed at 10:30. And I lay there in the dark next to my sleeping husband with the 47 seconds running on loop inside my skull, and I breathed in and breathed out. And I thought, now I begin. I want to tell you what those 3 months were like, because I think people have a very Hollywood idea of what happens after a discovery like this. They imagine screaming and slamming doors and confrontations and dramatic revelations. They don't usually imagine what it actually looks like, which is a woman going to work every day and making dinner and having normal conversations and laughing at things on television while simultaneously building, in the private architecture of her mind, a complete structural plan for the demolition of 2 people's carefully maintained lies. The first thing I did was call my therapist, Dr. Ellen Marsh, and book in emergency session. I told her I'd had a major revelation and I needed help processing it strategically. Ellen has been my therapist for 3 years. She is exactly the kind of therapist I needed for this specific situation. Not warm and huggy in the way that some therapists are, not someone who immediately wants to process feelings, but someone who asks precise questions and then gives you the space to hear your own answers. She does not push or project or offer unsolicited interpretations. She asks and then she waits. I value that enormously. I went to see her 2 days after finding the phone. I sat in her office on the blue chair that I have sat in probably 50 times, and I told her everything. The phone, the voicemail, the voice through the door at the funeral. 10 months ago that I had been telling myself meant nothing, the cold calculation I'd made on the floor. I told her all of it in the order it happened without any hysterics, and I watched her face stay entirely steady in the way she's trained it to be, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment. And then she said, "What do you want, Lauren? Not what are you going to do? Not what does this mean? Not let's talk about your feelings. What do you want?" And I sat with that question in the silence of her office for what felt like A very long time, because the answers that came up were layered and contradictory, and some of them I was not proud of. Part of me wanted to burn the whole thing down immediately. To call Nathan from the parking lot of Ellen's office and say, I know what you did and I know. With who and I know for how long, and let the chips fall. Part of me wanted, despite everything, for it to be a mistake, wanted someone to tell me there was an explanation, a context, a version of those 47 seconds that meant something different than what they obviously meant. Part of me wanted Nathan to beg. Part of me wanted Dana to feel, really feel in her body and her sleep and her everyday moments, exactly what she had made me feel. Part of me wanted to disappear and not have to deal with any of it at all. And underneath all of it, underneath every loud and jagged and contradictory feeling, I wanted to understand why. Not even how they'd managed it. Why? I told Ellen all of that. She nodded in the precise way she nods when she's absorbing rather than evaluating, and she said, the why may not give you what you're hoping for, but needing it is completely legitimate. What else do you want? I want it to be on my terms, I said. All of it. I want to know everything. Before they know I know anything. And then I want to choose when and how this ends. Ellen was quiet for another moment. Then she said, okay. Let's figure out what that requires. The second thing I did was talk to a lawyer. I have a friend from college, Rebecca Cho, who is a family law attorney practicing out of Cleveland, and I drove up on a Saturday under the guise of a shopping trip. I even actually went to 2 stores and bought a scarf I don't need, because I am thorough about this kind of thing, and I sat in Rebecca's kitchen with 2 cups of coffee, and I told her my situation and asked what my options were. Rebecca is the kind of lawyer who does not waste words or soften information. She told me that in Ohio, marital fault including infidelity doesn't directly impact property division, but can be considered in spousal support determinations. She told me about the house. We'd bought it together. It was marital property. It would be part of the settlement. She told me to begin quietly gathering documentation of our marital assets, accounts, investments, property, anything joint. She told me to open a personal checking account in my name only at a bank I did not share with Nathan, and to begin building a modest financial cushion gradually, not dramatically, nothing that would register as suspicious. On a joint statement, just a regular transfer each month. Then, as I was putting on my coat to leave, she said something I've thought about almost every day since, the fact that it's your sister that's a different kind of wound. Most betrayed spouses are dealing with one rupture. You're dealing with 2. Make sure you're planning for both. Because the marriage ending is one grief. Losing a sister is another. And they're going to require different things from you. I drove home to Columbus thinking about that. The whole 90 minutes. She was right. Nathan was my husband, but Dana was my history. Dana was every Christmas morning and every terrible middle school memory and every phone call at 2 a.m. and every hospital waiting room and every ordinary Sunday of my entire life. You can divorce a spouse. You cannot divorce a childhood. You cannot undivide what was never meant to be divided. And whatever I decided to do about my marriage, the question of what I was going to do about my sister was a completely separate, equally devastating, entirely different problem. The third thing I did was gather information. Not because I needed it to confirm what I already knew I knew, but because I had decided I wanted to know everything, the full shape of it, every date and detail before I was ready to act. Nathan, I discovered, was not a careful person. This surprised me. I had always thought of him as detail-oriented. He was an engineer, for God's sake. His entire professional life was about precision and measurement. But when it came to this, he had been careless in ways that, once I was looking, were almost embarrassing in their visibility. Maybe he had just been so comfortable for so long, so certain that I was not looking, would not look, had no reason to look, that he'd stop being careful. Or maybe he had a quiet part of him that wanted to be caught. I've thought about that possibility more than Once, and I still don't have a conclusion. He used the letter D as the contact on his old phone. On his laptop, which we shared for streaming, a setup I'd never had any concern about because we'd been sharing it for 3 years, and I'd had no reason to pay attention to the browser's saved accounts. There was a secondary Gmail address listed in the drop-down. Something like natec.82 at Gmail, the kind of anonymous side account you create when you need a login that isn't attached to your main identity. It was listed right there. He hadn't signed out. He hadn't even closed the tab the last time he'd used it. On our shared laptop. When I opened it, he was in the shower. I had approximately 8 minutes. It wasn't even password protected on this device. The browser had it saved. 4 years. That's what the emails told me. They had been having an affair for 4 years. Starting, and this is the detail that still catches me, sometimes in the sternum when I think about it. Starting approximately 4 months after we moved into this house. 4 months. After Dana stood in our doorway with the casserole and the pine tree dish, towel and the bottle of Malbec, and told us we were going to be so happy here. There were references in the oldest emails to things that had already happened between them, which meant the digital trail I was looking at wasn't even the beginning. The beginning was earlier than the emails. The beginning predated the record. 4 years and 4 months minimum. I did not print anything. I took screenshots on my personal phone, my own phone. That had a separate passcode I'd never shared with Nathan, and I documented dates and times, and made notes in a locked note app that required Face ID. I built a record. I did it with the same methodical precision I bring to managing large construction projects at work, phased, documented, cross-referenced. Alongside all of that, I began paying attention differently. Not trying to catch them in real time. I had what I needed, but watching in the way you can only watch once you know what you're looking for. And the things I started seeing made me feel, simultaneously, like a fool for not having seen them earlier, and like a person standing in a gallery looking at a painting she's passed 100 times and suddenly understanding what it actually depicts. Nathan's phone, face down on the dinner table. I'd always thought that was a habit of courtesy, not hiding. Their occasional Saturday golf days with the guys. Nathan genuinely plays golf, genuinely has golf friends, but the frequency had crept up in the last 2 years, and I'd attributed it to stress. Relief. Dana, sometimes, knowing details about Nathan's week or his current projects that she could only know if they'd spoken recently. I'd always credited that to her being perceptive, or to things I'd mentioned and forgotten mentioning. There was one night, about 5 weeks into my investigation, that the 3 of us had dinner together at our house. Dana brought wine. Nathan grilled chicken. We sat on the back patio under the string lights I'd hung 2 summers ago, and the evening was cool, and the food was good, and the conversation was easy, and it looked exactly like what I had always believed it to be, a happy, uncomplicated family moment. I sat at that table and I watched them with new eyes, and there were moments. Not dramatic, not obvious, not the kinds of things that would register on any objective camera, that were almost imperceptible. A glance that lasted a fraction of a second too long. A private laugh at a reference that had the specific quality of belonging to people who share history you don't have access to. A moment where Dana reached past the salad bowl and her hand brushed his arm, and neither of them reacted, and the not reacting was itself a kind of information. I had more wine than I usually do at that dinner. I talked about a documentary about deep-sea creatures that I'd actually watched that week, and I asked Dana about the renovation she was doing in her bathroom, and I listened to Nathan talk about a difficult client, and I smiled at the right moments and refilled glasses and contributed to the conversation. And when I finally drove them away from the table, we'd been outside for 3 hours, it had gotten cold. I hugged Dana goodbye at the door and felt her arms around me with the full awareness of what those arms had been doing, and I said, "Drive safe, I love you," and I meant it, and that was the most bewildering part of all of this. That I could still mean it. After they left, I went upstairs and stood in the shower for a long time and then I sat on the bathroom floor and I cried for the first time since finding the phone. Really cried, the specific kind of crying that lives in your chest and your stomach and comes out of you in a way that isn't graceful or photogenic, ugly, necessary, physical. I cried for myself and the years I'd spent loving people who were making choices at my expense. I cried for my father, who had loved Dana and Nathan both without reservation and without knowledge of any of this, who had died without knowing that the family dinner table he'd blessed every Thanksgiving was a theater of deception, and I felt, in a way that surprised me and that I spent some time examining afterward, a sharp and specific relief that he hadn't known, that he'd gone believing we were who we seemed. I cried for about 20 minutes and then I washed my face and went to bed. During this period, there was also a moment that I need to tell you about. Because it was the moment I realized I was not just surviving this, I was capable of something I hadn't known I was capable of. About 6 weeks into the planning phase, Nathan and I had a completely ordinary argument. Nothing serious. It was about whose turn it was to schedule the furnace service, which is the kind of argument that exists in every long-term relationship and means absolutely nothing. He got slightly snappy about it, I got slightly cold, and then we both let it go within about 15 minutes. But during those 15 minutes, for the first time in our entire relationship, I felt nothing. Not hurt by his tone, not guilty about my coldness, not the immediate urge to resolve the tension that I had always felt before. I looked at this man who was my husband and who had been living a double life for 4 years, and I felt nothing. Not even anger. Just a kind of flat, clarifying absence. And I understood in that moment that I was already gone. The decision I'd made on the bedroom floor wasn't really a strategic decision. It was a grief process. I was already leaving. I just hadn't told him yet. My mother's birthday is in March. She was turning 70 and she had asked, explicitly in the way my mother asks for things, which is gently but with absolute clarity, for a small family dinner. Just the 4 of us, her, me, Nathan and Dana. No surprise party, no large gathering of people she'd have to perform for. Just the people she loved most, in a home she felt comfortable in, with good food and a bottle of whatever wine she was in the mood for. I told her I'd host it. I had agreed about a month before I found the phone. I kept the dinner on the calendar. I know how that sounds. I know what you're probably thinking right now, that choosing a parent's milestone birthday as the setting for this kind of reckoning is either deeply deliberate or deeply cruel, and the answer is that it is both and neither, because the truth is that I didn't choose it as a weapon. I chose it because it was the next moment when all of us would be in the same room, and I had decided that I could not sustain another family gathering after this one in the current conditions. The weight of another dinner, another evening of performed normalcy, was more than I was willing to carry. I had also, by this point, made a decision about my mother that had cost me more internal debate than anything else in this entire process. I had wrestled with whether to tell her. My mother was 70 years old. She had just lost my father 6 months ago. She was still, visibly, grief-softened in ways that broke my heart on a daily basis. Was it fair? Was it right? Was it kind to bring this into her life? I went back and forth on this for weeks. I talked to Ellen about it. I talked to Rebecca about it. I walked around the block for an hour and a half one evening talking to myself about it, which I am sure made me look insane, but which was genuinely necessary. And I kept arriving at the same conclusion. My mother deserved to be a person who had real information about the world she was living in. She was going to continue building a relationship with Dana. She was going to continue inviting Dana to holidays and calling Dana on Sundays and directing love and time and finite energy toward Dana in all the ways that mothers love their daughters. And she was going to do all of that without knowing what Dana was capable of. That felt wrong to me. That felt like the deepest kind of disrespect, not toward my mother's vulnerability, but toward her intelligence and her autonomy and her right to make choices about her own life with full information. My father had always said that the most loving thing you can do for someone is tell them the truth when the truth matters. He said that in the context of teaching, telling a student they were failing rather than letting them coast toward a grade they hadn't earned, but I believe it extends further than classrooms. I decided I would tell my mother. Not at the birthday dinner, not in the middle of the evening. I was not going to use her birthday as the moment of revelation. But that night in her kitchen, I would tell her. After Nathan had been confronted. After Dana knew I knew. She would not go home that night without the truth. In the weeks leading up to the dinner, I prepared. I knew exactly what I was going to say to Nathan and how. I had decided I would not give a speech. I had considered giving a speech and ultimately rejected it because speeches in these moments tend to be for the speaker and not for the recipient, and what I wanted from this confrontation was not catharsis for myself but clarity for him. I wanted him to understand, without ambiguity, that I knew everything and that the choice now was not between telling me and not telling me but between a clean exit and a complicated one. The dinner itself was at 6 o'clock. My mother arrived first 10 minutes early the way she always does, carrying a bunch of daffodils she'd cut from the yard of the house she still sometimes called our house before catching herself and saying my house in a voice that was barely audible. She looked older in the way grief ages you, not physically diminished but thinner in some essential way, as though a layer of insulation that had always been there had been removed and the world was now reaching her more directly. I hugged her for longer than I normally would, and she hugged me back just as long. And I felt the specific sensation of holding someone you love while knowing something that is about to change everything. Dana arrived at 6:20, just as Nathan was coming downstairs from getting ready. She had a cake from the bakery, chocolate with salted caramel frosting, my mother's favorite, and a wrapped gift, and she was wearing a blue dress and her hair was down, and she looked exactly the way she always looks, beautiful and warm and genuinely, uncomplicatedly glad to be somewhere. She hugged my mother first, which was right. Then she turned to me. You look beautiful, Lauren, she said, exactly the way she has always said it. Exactly the warmth I have heard in that sentence, my entire life. Thank you, I said. I took her coat. I hung it in the closet. I went to pour more wine. Dinner was long and the food was good, and the conversation was the conversation. That happens when you are four people who have shared years of history and are all, in different ways and to vastly different degrees, carrying things that aren't being said. My mother talked about the garden. Nathan asked Dana about a project. I asked my mother about the novel she'd been reading. Dana told a story about something that had happened at her office that made everyone laugh. It was so normal it was almost surreal. It was so normal that sitting inside it felt like what I imagine it feels like to have a fever dream that is indistinguishable from everyday life, familiar textures, recognizable faces, but some fundamental unreality humming just underneath the surface. After dinner, my mother and Dana started clearing the table while Nathan and I brought dishes to the kitchen. My mother ran hot water and Dana picked up a dish towel, the pine tree dish towel, the one she'd brought with the casserole the day we moved in, which I had used tonight for the first time in years because some part of me wanted it in the room, wanted that particular irony present, and they stood at the sink together and talked in the easy, quiet way of a mother and her daughter doing something domestic. And Nathan drifted into the living room with his phone. I went to the doorway of the living room. I said, "Can you come see something?" In the study. "I want to show you something." He looked up from his phone. "Now." "Just for a minute." He set his phone down on the couch. He followed me into the study. I closed the door. The old phone was on the desk. I had placed it there before dinner, queued up, battery charged. It sat between us on the wood surface, and I watched his eyes find it, and I watched something cross his face, not recognition. Immediately, but the beginning of something adjacent to it. I didn't say anything. I pressed play. I watched his face through all 47 seconds. I had imagined this moment dozens of times in the preceding months, and I had never quite gotten it right. In my imagination, I'd pictured him looking panicked or guilty or combative or defensive. What I actually saw was none of those things. What I saw was a man whose face went very quiet and then very still, like something had been unplugged, like the performance of normalcy he had been maintaining for years had simply turned itself off because the reason to maintain it no longer existed. He said, "Lauren." I said, "How long before that voicemail?" He was quiet. He looked at the desk. He looked at me. And then he said, 4 years and 4 months. I nodded. Hearing him say it aloud was its own specific kind of pain. Different from knowing it, different from having seen it in the emails. Hearing him say it in his own voice in our study, in our house, on a Thursday evening. In March, made it real in a way that all the evidence had not quite achieved. It became, in those 4 words, a fact that had been spoken into the room and could not be taken back. I said, "I want you to leave tonight. I've already spoken to an attorney. I'll have separation papers drawn up next week. I am not going to fight about the house or the assets. I want a clean end, and I want it to be respectful. And I want it to be done." He asked if we could talk. I told him there wasn't anything about us that I wanted to discuss. His timeline for leaving was the only topic I was interested in. He looked at me for a long moment, and I want to be honest. That in that moment, he looked like a person who was genuinely, thoroughly broken, and I felt something for that, some flicker of a feeling that wasn't sympathy exactly but was adjacent to it, some residual warmth from years of loving someone that doesn't just switch off even when you need it to, and then he nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll pack what I need tonight." And then he said, "Are you going to tell Dana you know?" I said, "I'm going to tell her right now." He opened his mouth and then closed it. He sat down in the chair by the window, and I left the study, and I walked back down the hallway to the kitchen. My mother was drying a glass. Dana was putting the serving platter back in the cabinet where it lives, the 3rd shelf, the one that's slightly too high, and requires her to go up on her toes, which she always does with the specific grace of someone who has done it 1,000 times. They both looked up when I walked into the kitchen, and they must have seen something in my face. I have been told I have a face that is very bad at keeping secrets, which makes the last 14 months even more remarkable in retrospect, because my mother set the glass down very carefully on the counter, and Dana went still with her arms still extended toward the cabinet shelf. I looked at Dana. I said, very quietly, very evenly, with every bit of stillness I had spent 3 months building, "I know. 2 words. That's all. I know." The thing about those 2 words, said in that tone, to the right person is that they are entirely sufficient. They don't need elaboration. The right person hears them and understands everything. I watched Dana's face as she heard them, and I watched her understand. What happened to her face was not what I had expected. I want to be very precise about this, because I have replayed this moment many times, and I think getting it right matters. I had expected some combination of denial, panic, deflection, the instinct to negotiate or explain. What I saw was none of those things. What I saw was something that looked unmistakably like relief. Like a person who has been holding their breath underwater for a very long time and has just finally been allowed to surface. She said, "Oh God, Lauren." Her voice broke on my name. My mother looked between us slowly and said, very carefully, in the specific voice she uses when she is assembling something from incomplete information, "What's happening?" I sat down at the kitchen table. My mother and Dana both turned toward me, and I looked at my mother, 70 years old, widowed 6 months ago, standing in her kitchen with a dish towel in her hands, and I told her everything. Starting from the voice through the door at my father's funeral, through the found phone and the voicemail, through 3 months of documentation, through the conversation that had just happened in the study. I told her all of it. Sitting at that table, in the house where I had grown up, at the kitchen table. Where I had done homework and eaten 1,000 dinners and had every important conversation of my childhood. Dana cried through my entire account. Not the way she cried at the funeral. Not the full-body, unashamed grief crying. This was quieter and more private. The kind of crying that knows it doesn't have the right to be loud. Tears just ran down her face continuously, and she didn't wipe them. She sat in the chair across from me and cried and didn't say anything. My mother did not cry. She sat with her hands flat on the table in front of her, completely still, her face in an expression I had never seen on it before. Not blank, not hard, but concentrated. The face of someone absorbing a truth and measuring it against every prior fact she thought she had. When I finished, the room was very quiet. My mother did not speak for a long time. A minute maybe longer. And then she said, to Dana, in a voice that was entirely neutral in the most frightening way, "Is this true?" Dana said yes. My mother looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked back at me. Dana tried to speak. She said she was sorry more times than I counted. She said she knew there was no excuse. She started once to try to explain, not to justify, she said specifically, but to explain how it had started, and I let her talk for a little while, and then I said, very quietly, "Dana, stop." And she stopped. I said, "I love you. I have always loved you. You are my sister, and that is not something that goes away because you want it to. But you have to understand that you don't just get to be my sister right now. You have to earn the right to be in my life. And I don't know yet whether you will or whether you won't. But that is what's true tonight." She nodded. She couldn't speak. My mother reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her hand was cool from the dishwater, slightly damp. She held my hand and she said, with the specific precision of a woman who knows exactly what words to choose. "And when your father would have been so proud of how you've handled this." And that was the moment. That specific sentence. That was when I cried. Not with Nathan. Not hearing the voicemail. Not sitting on the floor of my bedroom. Not telling my mother the truth. But at those words, at the vision of my father proud of me, at the knowledge that he was not there and never would be there to say them himself, I cried at the kitchen table of my childhood home on my mother's 70th birthday, and my mother kept her hand on mine and did not tell me it was going to be okay, because she is far too honest for that and too loving. Nathan left that night. 3 bags, his guitar, his laptop. He drove away from the house, and I stood in the front doorway and watched the taillights until they were gone around the corner, and then I went back inside and closed the door and stood in the entry hall of my house that was now only mine. The quiet was enormous. I stood inside it for a while. And then I went to the kitchen and made tea and washed the dishes that were left. I want to tell you about what came after. Not just the logistics, the divorce proceedings, the legal documents, the complicated social geography of mutual friends being asked to choose sides in a conflict they hadn't signed up for. All of that happened, and I'll tell you about it. But I also want to tell you about the texture of the daily life I started building on the other side of that kitchen table, because I think that is the part of stories like this that gets left out, what it actually feels like to live inside the aftermath when the dramatic moment is over and all you have left is Tuesday morning. The divorce moved slowly, the way legal processes do, with paperwork and filings and communications between lawyers that were the administrative language of dismantling a marriage. Nathan did not contest anything significant. He got a lawyer, we each made our arguments, and we settled without going to court, which I had wanted for practical reasons, but which also required an ongoing mutual willingness to deal with each other through intermediaries rather than in open conflict, and I will give Nathan this much. He held up his end of that. We have not spoken directly since the night he left. Everything has gone through Rebecca and his attorney and the occasional email when something small but administrative required direct communication. The house is mine. I bought him out of his equity, which my carefully built financial cushion made possible, and which means I did not have to sell and move and start completely over in a new space during the same period that I was also starting completely over in every other way. This was important to me. The house was the one constant I had chosen to keep, the one piece of the architecture of my former life that I wasn't willing to let go of. Because I'd had a hand in choosing every room and every window and every inch of the backyard, and because it was mine before any of this happened. And I refused to be displaced from it. I painted the dining room. It was the first thing I did after the separation. Was finalized, went to the hardware store, spent an embarrassing amount of time looking at swatches, and came home with a gallon of a color called rosemary stem, which is a deep, warm, saturated sage green. I painted it myself on a Saturday in April, music on, windows open, slightly incompetent. With the edging tool but getting better as I went. It took 11 hours. And 2 glasses of wine, and I loved every minute of it. I stood in the doorway. When I finished at 11 p.m., smelling like paint and satisfied beyond anything I could have predicted, and I thought, this is mine. This exact green is mine. I picked it alone and it is perfect. My friends have been extraordinary in ways I did not fully anticipate because when you've been married for several years, your friendships exist partly within the container of the marriage. There are couples you see as a couple there. Are friends who are really his friends or your friends or both, and when the marriage ends, all of those social structures rearrange themselves in ways that you cannot fully predict. Some people surprised me by being less present than I expected. Some people surprised me by being more present, by showing up in ways I hadn't asked for and didn't know I needed. My friend Miriam, we've known each other since grad school. She lives about 20 minutes from me. She is exactly the kind of person I should have spent more time with in the years when Nathan was absorbing most of my social energy. Miriam started coming to my house every Saturday morning for the first 2 months after Nathan left, without being asked, without making it a formal plan. She would just text Friday night to say, I'm bringing coffee. 8:30 okay, and then she would show up and we would sit on the back porch and drink coffee, and sometimes talk about what was happening, and sometimes talk about completely other things, and sometimes just sit there watching the yard be a yard, and she never once told me how I should feel or what I should do or offered unsolicited advice, and that specific restraint, the choice to be present without directing, was one of the most loving things anyone has ever done for me. There is also my friend Deb, who called me the day after the dinner and said, bluntly, I never liked Nathan very much actually, and I've been waiting for permission to say that for 2 years. Which made me laugh, a real laugh. The first real laugh in a while, and which was exactly the right thing at exactly the right time. And there is Priya, who has known Dana longer than she's known me. They went to college together, and Priya is the kind of person who takes friendship seriously as an ethical commitment, and Priya called me 2 weeks after the dinner, clearly distressed, and said she didn't know what to say and she didn't want to make it worse, and she understood if I didn't want to talk to her, and the fact that she led with uncertainty rather than with immediate loyalty to either of us made me trust her more, not less. My mother has navigated this with a composure and a heartbreak that I have watched at careful distance, not wanting to crowd her process or add my own needs to her plate when she is already carrying so much. She has not cut Dana out of her life. I wouldn't have wanted her to, and I don't think she could, because whatever my mother is feeling about what Dana did, Dana is still her daughter, still her younger child, still the person she raised from birth. What has happened is more subtle than a cut. There is a new quality to how my mother speaks about Dana, a carefulness, a restraint. And I believe Dana feels it, and I believe it is its own kind of consequence. And I believe my mother is doing what she believes is right in a situation where right is genuinely complicated. I increased my therapy to twice a week for the first 4 months. Now I go once a week, and Ellen tells me I am doing remarkably well, which I take to mean that I am processing this with forward movement and functional clarity, and that the devastation underneath has not entirely incapacitated me. I want to be honest about what I'm still carrying. Because I think the danger of telling a story like this, of packaging it into a narrative arc with a beginning and a middle and an ending, is that it implies a tidiness that the actual experience doesn't have. The actual experience is messier than this. There are still mornings when I wake up and the first thought I have before I'm fully conscious is the flat gray thought of what I lost and I have to get up and make coffee and put my feet on the floor before that thought starts to clear. There are still moments when something happens, a funny thing at work, a moment in a movie that would have been Nathan's kind of joke, where I reach for a person who isn't there, and the missing is clean and cold and simple. There are still moments when I miss Dana in a way that doesn't feel like anger but like grief, like losing someone to distance or death, rather than choice like a form of mourning. Ellen says I am good at managing my grief and less good at actually living inside it, and she is right, and we are working on it. I've started running. I ran cross country in high school, my father coached. The team and I was never the fastest, but I was the most consistent, which he always said was the most important thing, and I stopped when I graduated. And just never picked it back up, the way you drop things in the business of becoming an adult. But something about this winter made me need to move. Need to do something physical that was entirely and exclusively for me, that had nothing to do with anyone else's timeline or presence or needs. I started going out in the early mornings, before work, before the neighborhood fully wakes up, and it has been unexpectedly, powerfully healing. Not because running solves anything, but because there is something about the specific discipline of it, the willingness to feel effort and not stop the body metabolizing something the mind hasn't finished processing, that has given me back a version of myself I'd misplaced somewhere in the years of being a wife and a daughter and a sister. I ran a 5K last month. It was cold, barely 40 degrees at race time, and the course went through the park 2 miles from my house. I had trained for it for 8 weeks. I ran the whole thing without stopping, which was not a given going in, and I crossed the finish line in 31 minutes, which is not a remarkable time, and was a remarkable time because it was mine. My father would have been at that finish line. He would have had a homemade sign with terrible handwriting, and he would have been standing exactly where he could see me coming for the full last quarter mile, and he would have been yelling something embarrassing in a voice too loud for the situation, the way he always did at my races when I was 17. He wasn't there, but I could feel the outline of where he would have been, and I ran through it and I finished. I'm running the next one in April. I'm aiming for 29 minutes. There is something I have been holding back. I've been saving it for here. Because it is the piece of this story I am least sure how to talk about. The part that doesn't resolve cleanly, that doesn't fit neatly inside the narrative of a woman who found out the truth and acted on it and is now rebuilding. The part that is still genuinely unfinished. About 6 weeks ago, Dana left a card in my mailbox. Not in the mail, she drove to my house and placed it in the box herself. I know this because the handwriting on the envelope was hers, there was no postage, and there was no return address. She had come to the house where we'd had family dinners for years, stood at the end of my driveway and put an envelope in the box. She didn't ring the doorbell. She didn't call. She just left it. The envelope had my name on it in her handwriting. Lauren. Just my name. In her specific, loopy, slightly leftward tilting script that I have been reading since I was old enough to read, that I have seen on birthday cards and notes and the backs of receipts and grocery lists and get well soon messages and every form of casual written communication between us for 39 years. I did not open it for 3 days. It sat on my kitchen counter and I walked past it in the morning and walked past it in the evening and thought about it and chose not to open it and walked past it again. I am not entirely sure what I was waiting for. Permission, maybe. Readiness. The feeling of being ready doesn't always announce itself. On the 3rd day, I made tea, sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. Inside was a plain note card. Not a store-bought card with a preprinted sentiment. She had known better than to send one of those. Just a small note card, blank front, and her handwriting on the inside. She wrote, "I'm not asking for anything. I know I don't have the right to ask you for anything. I just need you to know that I understand what I did. Not just the fact of it, I understand what it cost you. I understand what you lost. Not just a marriage, but the version of your family that you believed in. I see that. I see all of it. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. But I couldn't keep going without you, knowing that I see what I did to you. You were my person. You have been my person my entire life, and I chose to act in a way that made me unworthy of that. That's on me. It will always be on me. I love you. I know that's complicated now, but it's the truest thing I can say." I read it 4 times. I put it back in the envelope. I put the envelope in the drawer of my desk where I keep things I'm not ready to throw away and not ready to act on. I don't know what I'm going to do with it. I have thought about this more than I've thought about almost anything else in the past 6 weeks. I know that forgiveness is not the same thing as resuming a relationship, that it is possible to release the poison of a wound from your own body without reopening the door to the person who introduced the poison. I know that. Intellectually. What I don't know yet is which version of that I'm capable of. With Dana, whether I can find my way to the first part, the releasing, and whether that releasing will eventually want to be accompanied by something that looks like a relationship, or whether the damage is structural in a way that makes rebuilding architecturally impossible. I also know, and this is the part that keeps me up sometimes, not with anguish but with genuine uncertainty, that she is my only sibling. That my mother is 70 years old. That my father is gone. That the family I have is smaller than it used to be and is not going to get larger. That none of us are going to be here indefinitely. That my father died with things unsaid to people he loved and never got the time to say them. I know all of that. And I also know what 47 seconds of audio sounds like. And I also know what it felt like to sit on that floor. Both of those things are true simultaneously. They do not cancel each other out. They occupy the same space at the same time, the way very real and very painful things do, not neatly, not with resolution, just with the difficult, coexisting fullness of actual human experience. I put the card in the drawer. I haven't touched it since. The drawer is still closed. I want to tell you the things I know now that I didn't know before, not as lessons in the way that lessons are usually packaged, not as a neat list of takeaways, but just as things that are true for me now, in a way they were not before any of this happened. I know that certainty, the deep, bone-level certainty that you have found your people and built your life and can stop looking because the looking is done, is not something you earn and then keep. It is something that has to be tended. And when the people holding it with you stop tending it, stop being who you believed they were, the certainty goes with them. And that is not a failure of your love or your perception. It is just the reality of what other people are capable of, which is always more than you know. I know that the body keeps the score in the literal sense, that grief and betrayal live in your muscles and your sleep and your digestion and your immune system, and that moving your body, in whatever form that takes for you, is not a metaphor for healing, but a part of the actual mechanism of it. I know that the people who show up without being asked are the ones who love you most. The Saturday morning coffees that Miriam brought without explanation or agenda, those meant more to me than almost anything else in this entire period. Pay attention to who shows up, not who says the right thing. Who shows up. I know that being the one who holds things together is a gift and a cost simultaneously, and that I have spent most of my life paying the cost without really acknowledging the size of it. I know that my father was right about truth, that the most loving thing you can do for someone is not protect them from information, but trust them with it. That my mother deserved to know, even though the knowing hurt her, because the not knowing would have been its own kind of injury, slower, quieter. and ultimately more corrosive. I know that I do not want to become a person who is incapable of trust. That is the thing I am most careful about, not becoming someone for whom this experience is the last lesson, the one that closes everything down. I have been betrayed by two people I loved completely, and I refuse to let that refusal become the center of my identity. It is not who I am. It is something that happened to me. And I know, this last thing I know with the specific certainty of someone who has arrived somewhere after a very long walk, that I am not waiting to feel okay before I live my life. I am living my life right now in the middle of not being okay, in the middle of the unresolved drawer and the unfinished card and the April race and the sage green walls and the Saturday coffees and the therapy and the missing and the relief and everything else that is true simultaneously. I am not waiting to be healed to start. I have started. I started the night Nathan drove away and I stood in the doorway and then went and washed the dishes. That was the beginning. I told you at the beginning that I've listened to that voicemail 236 times. That's not quite accurate anymore. I deleted it 3 months ago. The recorded file is gone. The 47 seconds no longer exist on any device. I counted. I'm at 238. But the last two were in my memory. In the version of it that lives in me now, not in a phone, not in a file, not in anything external that someone else could press play on. It's mine now, fully, without Nathan's old phone as the container. Just mine. I decided I didn't need it anymore. I knew what it said. I had always known what it said. And carrying it on a device, keeping the original piece of the damage in a place I could access at any time, felt like a choice to remain inside the wound, rather than to let the wound be part of the past. The file is gone. The damage is still there. It is smaller than it was, and it will keep getting smaller. Not because I am forcing it to, but because life, when you let it, has a way of filling in around damage, the way water fills in around stone. Not eliminating it, but making it part of the landscape. I am in the middle of a life that looks entirely different from the life I thought I was living 14 months ago. That is true. And also true, I am in the middle of a life. An actual life with actual mornings and actual plans. And actual people who love me, and an April race I'm training for, and a dining room the exact shade of green I chose entirely alone. A life that is entirely mine in a way that it wasn't before, because before it was also Nathan's and also Dana's, and also built on a version of reality that was insignificant. Ways not real. This life is real. Every difficult inch of it. Every Saturday morning coffee. Every therapy session. Every mile. My name is Lauren Calloway. I am 42 years old. I live in a house outside of Columbus, Ohio, with sage green walls and a drawer that has a card in it that I haven't opened since the third day, and a morning running route that takes me past the park where my father used to coach, and a life that is against everything continuing. I am just getting started. And I am not going to stop. If this story hit you somewhere deep, if you found yourself pausing somewhere in the middle and just sitting with it, I want you to know that that feeling you're carrying right now is exactly why I tell stories like this. Because real stories, real people, real pain, and real survival, that deserves to be heard. That deserves a witness. So here's what I want you to do right now, before this video ends and before you scroll away. Drop a comment down below, not just great story, but tell me something real. Tell me what moment in Lauren's story hit you the hardest. Tell me if you've ever been in a version of this. Tell me what you would have done differently. I read every single comment. Everyone. And sometimes the comments are the best part of this whole channel. If you are brand new here, welcome. You found this place for a reason. Hit subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a story. I put up new ones every week, and they are always real, always emotional, and always worth your time. And if you know someone who needs to hear a story about strength right now, someone going through something hard, someone who needs to be reminded that People survive impossible things, share this video with them. You might not know exactly why it's the right thing to send, but they will. Lauren is getting started. Are you? I'll see you in the next one.